Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Thursday, February 22nd, 2018. Lots of news to talk about today, including the president posing as listening to the survivors and family members of victims of school violence. But he didn't listen too much. We'll update that in a moment. But today I want to lead with the issues related to the ongoing operation of the Gulag on the tip of Cuba called Guantanamo Bay. Most people don't talk about it. It's out of sight, out of mind. There are only 41 human beings being locked up there now. And most people are convinced that these are subhumans who don't deserve any rights whatsoever. And Americans who are spoon-fed a media diet that doesn't include voices from abroad, who observe that Guantanamo is an ugly monument to what passes for American justice. And I regard Guantanamo as a cancer on what remains of the American system of law, and that its continuing operation is really a reflection of the metastasizing of that cancer. It just continues to grow. And in recent weeks, as we've been distracted by Trump tweets, Russia, and many other issues, often of less importance, there have been some significant changes at Guantanamo. For example, without any explanation, Defense Secretary Mattis fired the convening authority, a man named Harvey Rishikoff. It's reported that Rishikoff was pursuing plea deals with the alleged masterminds of 9/11, led by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And separately, the case against the individuals accused of bombing the USS Cole in Yemen in the year 2000. That case has just spiraled into chaos. And you may have heard some of my recent updates. The judge in the case, Colonel Vance Spath, an Air Force colonel, suspended pretrial hearings in the death penalty case against the prisoner, a Saudi named al-Nashiri. And this happened after nearly the entire defense team quit late last year in protest over illegal monitoring of their private conversations with their client, and also critical legal issues that prevented them from discharging their duties to defend al-Nashiri. And the judge is still pissed about this. He said, "I am abating these proceedings indefinitely. I will tell you right now the reason I'm not dismissing the case. I debated it. I am not rewarding the defense for their clear misbehavior and misconduct, but I am abating these proceedings indefinitely until a superior court orders me to resume." Now, I think the defense attorneys showed great courage. Many of them defied efforts by Judge Spath to force them to continue to participate in a process that they believe is so poisoned that they cannot honorably continue to be a part of it. And over at Who, What, Why, and as you may know, I've got a relationship now with Who, What, Why. I'm producing a couple of podcasts each month for distribution via whowhatwhy.org. And James Henry has a great piece, Why the Accused 9/11 Mastermind Can't Get a Fair Trial. It opens like this. It's been nearly 17 years since 9/11. It's been 15 years since Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, one of the alleged 9/11 planners, was captured in Pakistan. And it's been 10 years since he was arraigned in a military court in Guantanamo. And that trial, too, is an ugly mess. And this is where the convening authority, Rishikoff, was fired. And his firing may be a violation of American law. We'll see if anybody tries to enforce it. But it was clearly aimed at preventing an outcome that the Trump administration found unacceptable. Because if Harvey Rishikoff had concluded plea deals, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and his co-defendants would end up with a life sentence in prison, probably to be served at Guantanamo as long as that is open. And it's very clear that the Trump administration and many political players of both parties in Washington, they want the outcome to be the death penalty. And the details don't matter. Whether the trial conforms to American standards, that doesn't matter. Everybody knows KSM did it, he's guilty, and let's just kill him. But that, of course, is a real insult to what I consider to be the American system of law and justice. And one of the sticking points is that the defense attorneys for KSM and his co-defendants, they want to introduce evidence that these individuals were tortured. Now, it's factual evidence that KSM was tortured. We know he was waterboarded 189 times. But the Pentagon insists that the location where he was waterboarded be treated as a secret, even though it's not. They prevented the defense attorneys from traveling to the black sites, which are no longer secret. These are places like in Poland and elsewhere, where the CIA was housing some of these suspects after they were taken into custody and before they were transferred to Guantanamo. And according to a recent story by Carol Rosenberg at the Miami Herald, who is about the only American reporter who does ongoing coverage, well, Charlie Savage in the New York Times drops in more often than not. But Rosenberg deserves a lot of credit for her diligence on Guantanamo. And she wrote, the issue is not whether the classified identities of CIA employees would be made public. They wouldn't. The issue is whether the defense team, with their top-secret security clearances, can interview any of these individuals. The government maintains they cannot for reasons of national security. And you know this is bullshit. Elena Wickner, current defense team member, former reservist in the Army's Judge Advocate General Corps, quote, to threaten prosecution against the defense for conducting an investigation that we are obliged to do shocks the conscience. Literally, my heart sunk. We pride ourselves on not being North Korea or Russia or any other so-called legal system that doesn't let you challenge the government's evidence. And so, once again, the premise here is that we have to pretend to have amnesia about things that are already out in public. They are public knowledge. And at this point, the meandering trial of KSM and his co-defendants is estimated to take another 3 or 4 years just to get to trial. And this speaks volumes about the chicanery, the ruse that is Guantanamo, and how the Bush administration tried to say that, well, you know, these are not prisoners of war, they're not covered by the Geneva Conventions, so we can hold them indefinitely without charge or trial, and of course we can torture them. Now, we all know that's not right. And Obama went halfway. He declared that he would discontinue any use of torture. But he didn't prosecute those who violated American law and international conventions. And so he left this cancer to metastasize as it continues to do. I also want to commend Kevin Gostola at Shadowproof. He covers these issues, and he has 2 recent reports. One is that the Trump administration has filed legal papers arguing that the continued detention of prisoners at Guantanamo amounts to, they're responding to a challenge that this amounts to perpetual detention for detention's sake. But they have declared that they can hold prisoners without charge or trial, not on an indefinite basis, but on an indeterminate basis. Now, that's parsing words to the point of meaninglessness. But the administration said because the end of hostilities cannot be predicted, does not render the detention perpetual or unconstitutionally indefinite. It serves a permissible purpose to prevent the return of members of enemy forces to the battlefield. Now, it's important to note that these issues are really being brought forward because of the work of the Center for Constitutional Rights. And its founder, Michael Ratner, passed away a year and a half ago. But it's an organization I really value, and when they're fighting for the constitutional rights of prisoners at Guantanamo, they are fighting for my constitutional rights, in my opinion. So this is the legal position of the administration, and I don't think it makes much sense. Also, yesterday, Kevin Gosztola at Shadowproof reported on a case that CCR, Center for Constitutional Rights, has been working on for over 10 years, related to torture visited on Iraqi citizens at the Abu Ghraib prison by Americans. And the case is against the military contractor known as CACI, Khaki Premier Technology. They provided the personnel who often directed the military in how to torture these prisoners. And Judge Liani Brinkema has ruled that plaintiffs have plausibly alleged that Khaki and its employees' actions to aid the abuses were undertaken with the necessary purpose of facilitating the abusive conduct because the goal of the abusive regime was to soften up the detainees to convince them to cooperate with Khaki's interrogators. And she declared, "It is clear that the abuse suffered by plaintiffs was intended to inflict severe pain or suffering and rises to the level of torture." Now, I consider this to be a very strong and accurate ruling. Why did it take 10 years for this case to meander through the process and reach a point where a judge does find standing for the individuals who have sued? I've linked to all of these articles in the show file for today's podcast. I encourage you to review them, and you will find the grim and grisly details of the torture that occurred at Abu Ghraib. Yesterday, Trump held what was called billed as a listening session at the White House. And the initial comments I saw on Facebook indicated that it was a hand-picked group of people that didn't include any family members from the Parkland school shooting on Valentine's Day in Florida. And that was incorrect. There were parents and students who were there, but it appears that many of them were selected because they are Trump supporters. Now, I can't prove that, but according to a news account in the New York Times, most of the students and parents invited from the Florida school appeared to support Mr. Trump. So I don't know how those decisions were made, who was filtered out, and who was allowed to speak. But as Trump posed as compassionate and eagerly listening to people's comments, one of the most moving was 18-year-old Sam Zeif. He survived the shooting at the school in Florida last week, and he turned 18 the next day, February 15th. And he said, "I don't understand why my friend was killed and I can still go into a store and buy a weapon of war, an AR. How is it that easy to buy this type of weapon? How do we not stop this after Columbine, Sandy Hook? I'm sitting with a mother who lost her son. It's still happening." Now, I give Trump credit for the optics of this event. It's different for him. In all the footage I saw, he didn't try to interrupt people. He was patting a grief-stricken girl on the back at one point. But of course, actions and tweets speak louder than Trump's words. And he ended the meeting by saying what he heard was, "We need to put more guns into schools." And this is a very misguided frame of mind. It's driven by the Second Amendment crowd, the NRA, and people, I guess, who sincerely believe that more guns, that armed teachers, armed coaches, that's going to be the way we beat this thing. And Trump believes that just by letting people know that there are teachers on a campus who have concealed weapons, that this would stop a crazy person from coming to that campus and shooting it up. But of course, Trump doesn't understand the complexities of human psychology. And at its fundamental worst, the motive of a school shooter is irrational. And so by trying to put rational barriers up, rational penalties or counter forces, the inference is that you can get people to be rational and to behave rationally. And that, to me, is the fundamental flaw in the argument that good guys with a gun are the answer to bad guys with guns. So Trump says he's going to push comprehensive background checks, and we'll get to that in a moment when we talk about the way the NRA has neutered the only federal agency that enforces existing gun regulation. He's talking about an emphasis on mental health. Well, what does that mean? Are psychiatrists going to report their patients? And what are the standards for that? What kind of protections are there to prevent people from having their private medical records exposed unnecessarily? There are a lot of details there, of course, that he doesn't address. Then he talks about raising the age to 21 and ending the sale of bump stocks. Now, these are acceptable losses to the NRA. Maybe not the age issue, but I believe most of the rest of them, they will oppose them, but in the end accept them as, as a very limited move from their perspective. So here's a quote from the Washington Post. Trump has offered no details on how a program of arming teachers would work, how much it would cost, how school districts would fund it. Arming 20% of teachers would mean arming more than 700,000 people. So, unfortunately, we're hearing many voices, including the students from the high school in Florida. They're saying, never again, and do something. Well, it appears that the something is not going to be terribly meaningful, and that Trump may be able to slip past this with some media skills and support from the hardline gun nuts in this country. At the New York Times today, a recap of the current status of the ATF. Now, the formal name of the agency was changed a few years ago. It's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. But nobody uses the E. It's always ATF. Now, Trump has not even nominated a director to oversee the agency, and he has been in office for 13 months now. The agency has only had permanent leadership for 8 of the past 12 years. When Obama nominated somebody to run the ATF, the NRA opposed that nomination, and it stuck. And the Times reports here, for decades, the NRA has used its sway in Washington to preserve the ATF in its limited capacity. It has aggressively lobbied against nominated directors, pushed Congress to enact restrictions on how the Bureau spends money to curtail its ability to regulate firearms and track gun crimes. One funding provision forbids the ATF from using electronic databases to trace guns to owners. Instead, the agency relies on a warehouse full of paper records. That's passive-aggressive behavior by the Congress at the behest of the NRA. And Trump didn't hear much in that listening session yesterday because he tweeted out this morning, what many people don't understand or don't want to understand is that Wayne, Chris, and the folks who work so hard at the NRA, he's referring to Wayne LaPierre, I don't know who Chris is, are great people and great American patriots. They love our country and will do the right thing. MAGA. So this is not promising, because even if we get new regulations, the double talk may appease some of the activists who think, well, we got something. We didn't just do nothing. But in the end, the enforcement mechanism is hobbled and intentionally left that way. For example, there are only 2,500 ATF agents, and they are retiring at a very rapid clip. 141 retired last year, and only 117 replacements were hired. So the ranks are thinning. And just like the IRS, gosh golly, they're not going to be able to do what they're expected to do, what their mission is defined as. Every day I pause for a second to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. People like Steve Wazinski, Linda Gray, and I want to make special mention of James Balk. He canceled his subscription recently, and he dropped me a note saying that he's had a few cash flow issues. And so James, he sent me a smaller check to renew his subscription. But James, I'm ripping up your check, and at the based on the generosity of other people who have paid more than they have to subscribe to this podcast, I'm going to issue you a 1-year scholarship. And if there are other listeners who are in a similar position, I don't want to be taking your money as a subscription if you have trouble buying groceries and paying the rent. So if you're in that position and you'd like to maintain a subscription, just email Peter at peterbcollins.com. I have never turned down a request for a scholarship. Also on the gun issue front, last night CNN held a town hall meeting, and Florida Senator Marco Rubio took a lot of boos and a lot of heat, and I am the last person in America who would defend him from any of that. And I didn't get to watch it. I had other obligations last evening. But I do want to note that I saw a report that one high school student from Parkland had been invited to ask a question on the CNN town hall. And when he showed up to participate, they tried to substitute a scripted question. Now, I've produced shows, many times, not particularly things like that, but many events where the public is involved, and sometimes you screen questions to avoid duplicates. But that doesn't seem to be what was going on here, and I just want to acknowledge that some of this may be orchestrated in ways that aren't apparent to the viewer. Today, I recorded and I'm releasing an in-depth interview with David K. Johnston, the Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter. He is really a prolific guy. He published The Making of Donald Trump last summer, and he's got a new book out called It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. And in the book, he recaps many different fronts with what he calls the termites that Trump has installed to destroy various federal agencies, and it includes all the ones you know about: the EPA, the Department of Education, Energy Department. It's an excellent book, and he, in my view, does a great service by not getting all caught up in the Trump-Russia obsession in Washington. He mentions it a little bit in the book, but that's not his main focus. And in our interview, he draws upon his years of knowledge. He's known Donald Trump since the late 1980s. And here, in this excerpt, he describes what a humorless, unhappy man Donald Trump is.
Donald Trump has no regard for anyone but Donald Trump. One of the key points in the beginning of my book is I go through a whole bunch of our presidents. We've had smart ones and dumb ones. We've had corrupt ones and honest ones, good ones, bad ones, middling ones. But all of them had in common one thing that you do not see in the Trump administration. Even the most corrupt of them all, Chester Arthur, who got us eventually the Pendleton Civil Service Act, they all did things that tried to make the country better. They may have had ideas that turned out to be bad or that didn't work out, but they were trying to make the country better. Donald Trump's only interest is Donald Trump. Period. Full stop. That is all this is about. It's all it's ever been about. It's all Donald has ever been about. And all you have to do is listen carefully to what he says. You know, a hurricane hits, Hurricane Harvey, and he and his wife go to Corpus Christi. She wears brand new white tennies, which her sneakers never show a bit of mud when they're leaving. And what does he do? He talks about the size of the crowd that turned out to see him.
Yeah.
He goes to a feeding station and he says, "Have a good time."
Right.
Donald Trump is. I mean, be glad, Peter, you're not Donald Trump. I've always felt sorry for him because this is a man who has never known joy and never will. He never laughs. I mean, I tried years ago once just to see if I could get him to laugh, and I finally got a sort of forced out of him.
Yeah.
He has no sense of humor whatsoever, and he really is a quite miserable human being inside because everything about him is about you're supposed to adore him and put money in his pocket. And those are hollow measures of a human life.
I invite my subscribers to catch up with the new interview with David K. Johnston. I'm releasing it today on iTunes, peterbcollins.com, TuneIn, Stitcher, Spreaker, and it's got a lot going on. So I hope you will dig in and get a lot out of it. The latest, and by the way, in my conversation with David K. Johnston, I applauded that he didn't get sucked into the whole Russiagate thing. And he said he does believe it. He thinks Trump is a traitor, and he thinks that there was some interaction between Russia and the Trump campaign. He and I disagree on that, but we do agree on the deep corruption of Trump and many of his cronies, and that ultimately he is running a cover-up and is exposed to liability for obstruction of justice. On to the Russiagate update. The right-wing talking point this week is that Mike Flynn got railroaded, was bamboozled into pleading guilty to lying to the FBI, and that he should withdraw his plea deal. Now, that's not easy to do to begin with, but they are claiming, based on the fact that the judge who has taken over the Mike Flynn trial, whose name is Emmett Sullivan, once ruled in favor of former Alaska Senator Ted Stevens, who was indicted on corruption charges, convicted by a jury, and then rejected by voters just a week later. And after he lost that election, an FBI whistleblower came forward to allege that federal prosecutors had withheld information from Stevens' defense team. And because Judge Sullivan now issues a statement in every trial before him, a directive about the requirement of the government to produce to defendant any evidence in its possession that is favorable to defendant and material either to defendant's guilt or punishment. That was based on what he learned from the Ted Stevens trial. And right-wingers, including Rush Limbaugh and others, have seized on this and said, look, this is the judge who's going to make things right for Mike Flynn. But it's really based on misinterpretation of the document that the judge filed related to these disclosure requirements. Yesterday, it was reported that Robert Mueller, the special counsel, has filed a sealed document in the Manafort case with the federal court in Washington. And NBC News is reporting, based on leaks from the special counsel, where else could it come from, that Manafort is being investigated for allegedly promising the president of the Chicago-based Federal Savings Bank that loaned him his mortgage a job in the Trump White House in return for $16 million in home loans on his properties in Virginia, New City, and the Hamptons, that's Long Island. Now, Jason Leopold, my friend who is writing over at BuzzFeed now, has accessed sources, presumably at the special counsel's office, informing him that this relates to an increase in the level of bank fraud and references to more recent bank fraud. So it's interesting, and I've linked to Leopold's report because what it shows is that the reason Paul Manafort was so quickly indicted by Bob Mueller is that they had already conducted an investigation several years ago into his international political consulting operation, and in particular his role in the Yanukovych government and the elections of Yanukovych in Ukraine. And this investigation goes back to 2014. It involved both the FBI and the Treasury Department, and they did find suspicious activity by Manafort, but they decided that he was too small a fish because he was only laundering millions, not billions. So this is interesting. It does provide some backstory, and the report indicates, again, based on unnamed sources, that the special counsel has discovered actions that Manafort took during the 2016 election cycle, where he was using his position as Trump's campaign manager to dangle benefits before people who he needed favors from. Over at The Intercept, there is a new podcast with James Risen, the former New York Times reporter who supports the Russiagate narrative, facing off with Glenn Greenwald. And I haven't had a chance to watch it yet. I will catch up with it tonight. But people who've watched it said that this is good journalism, that both sides are being presented, and that is rare in the coverage of this scandal so far. Also at The Intercept, I've linked to a story by Lee Fung about a Democratic congressional candidate in New York State. His name is Patrick Ryan, and he has a deep background in the surveillance state. He was working at a firm called Barrico Technologies, where he compiled a plan to create a real-time surveillance operation of left-wing groups and labor unions. He was exposed in the H.B. Gary Federal and Peter Thiel Palantir Technologies case back in 2011. Then he started up a company called Data Miner, a data analytics company that provided social media monitoring solutions for law enforcement clients. So this guy is neck deep in the surveillance state in this country, and he is challenging Republican freshman John Faso for a seat in the Hudson Valley area of New York State that was won by Trump in 2016. So Mr. Ryan is being supported by the New Democrat Coalition PAC, which is also alongside the Blue Dog PAC, and there is a significant effort to pack the Congress with moderate and conservative Democrats in the 2018 cycle. And Pat Ryan is somebody we certainly don't need in the House of Representatives. And finally today, here in California, a couple of updates on sexual harassment scandals in our state capital, Sacramento. Yesterday, the leader of the state Senate, Kevin De Leon, who is challenging Dianne Feinstein for her U.S. Senate seat and is trying to burnish his credentials in the Me Too era, he took out one of his fellow colleagues. Yesterday, he filed papers to hold a vote today to expel Tony Mendoza from the California State Senate. Now, Mendoza has been accused of sexual harassment by multiple people over a 10-year period. And Mendoza today decided not to fight it. Quote, "I shall resign my position as senator with immediate effect, as it is clear that Kevin De Leon will not rest until he has my head on a platter to convince the Me Too movement of his sincerity in supporting the Me Too cause." Mendoza criticized the investigation as unfair and secret, a violation of his civil rights and due process. The inability to view and understand the accusations in a timely fashion rubs across the grain of fairness, impartiality, and ultimately justice. So I don't know if Tony Mendoza is as innocent as he claims. There was a process. He was investigated by an outside law firm. They reported that it was more likely than not that he engaged in unwanted, flirtatious, or sexually suggestive behavior toward 6 women since 2007. He invited an employee to share a room with him in Hawaii. He drank alcohol with a 19-year-old intern. And last year, he invited a Senate fellow to come to his home under the guise of reviewing resumes for a full-time job that he was dangling in her direction. So Tony Mendoza is out. But one of the leaders of the Me Too movement in Sacramento is a member of the state assembly, that's the lower house, Cristina Garcia from the Los Angeles area. She is now on leave after having led the charge to expose sexual harassment and to bring justice, whatever they call it these days, to harassers in the state capitol. But Cristina Garcia is now on leave, fending off allegations that she regularly talked about her sexual activity with her staff, that she drank alcohol while doing official business, pressured staff to join her in drinking at the office or at bars. She took the crew out for drinks at a whiskey bar, then back to a hotel room where she is reported to have told them to engage in a game of kiss the bottle. And one male staffer who refused says that he was fired in retaliation just 2 weeks later. Garcia also is reported by 3 other former staff members to have talked rather openly about her sexual activity with fellow members of the legislature, and that having sex with them in their offices was a good way to get information. So this, of course, is very damaging. Cristina Garcia said she will address each of the issues once an investigation has been completed. I am confident I have consistently treated my staff fairly and respectfully. In a fast-paced legislative office, not everyone is the right fit for every position, and I do understand how a normal employment decision could be misinterpreted by the individual involved in that decision. Based on this, I think Cristina Garcia should be preparing her resignation letter, too. Thanks for joining me for my News and Comment podcast. We post it up on YouTube. And while you're there, click on the subscribe button. No money involved, but it'll help me out.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.